Friday. Welcome to our usually weekly, except for when we get really busy, privacy chat. I am Jules Polonetsky, CEO of the Future Privacy Forum, working from home today, as you can tell by my messy bookcase backdrop. And I'm joined by some senior members of our team, Stacey Gray, who's helps lead or deputy for our U.S. policy team. Started out many years ago helping lead our ad tech related work, and now has a much broader scope. And thank you for joining this morning, Stacey. Aaron Massey, one of our newer members, computer scientist, a computer science professor who joined us. Is it a year already? Less than a year, I think.
6 months or so.
6 months ago, and leads work around ed tech and helps support our deeper technology thinking. So they're with me today because they have been working on a close look at universal opt-out mechanisms, known by some of the folks in our audience as global privacy controls or other similar tools that are increasingly part of state laws now in multiple states. They're in the market. We started seeing enforcement. There was some debate due to the lack of precision, perhaps, in the California law about exactly how it would work, what would be mandated, this and that. But I think a lot of that debate has been put to bed by the fact that the AG has made enforcement of compliance with this as a priority. So for the most basic, and then I'll hand over to Stacey and Aaron to dig deep for the most basic notion. Many of you know that a cornerstone of many of the new state laws is a right to opt out of the sale of your personal information or sharing, whatever that means. But the law gives lots of detail about pretty much anything beyond a very processor vendor type use. It uses some awkward terminology for those of us who've kind of gotten used to the notion of controller or processor or agent or vendor. It kind of clearly intends to get at the ad tech related sharing. Many companies previously said, I don't share personal information. But of course, they had ad tech relationships, and they viewed perhaps cookies or mobile ad IDs or some of the other stuff that happens when your data goes into this ecosystem as not sharing your personal information. The law clearly is designed to prevent that sort of activity, or at least, shall I say, give people a strong opt-out right. Websites have to say, you now see it in California and other states, do not sell my personal information, do not sell or share my personal information. Or the update to this law goes a little further and gives you a right to an opt-out of sort of out of context, shall we say, use of sensitive personal information, where you have the right to opt out of even the first party use, even the company you're dealing with using that. And that is actually mandated to be in the disclosure as well, although you can kind of squeeze it in. And so policies are getting longer, new statements on sites are getting longer, and each state has different nuances. And so things are getting more complicated. So our team took a look at the common tools that are out there today that people can download, browser plugins, different, mostly web-based options. We're looking at the comments. And so if you want to agree, disagree, interject, tell us something, we will respond. And so please do chime in. So without further ado, I think, Stacey, are you going to kick us off? There's a report that's coming out soon that isn't yet out, where we are going to publish what we found, but give us some more info there.
Yes, awesome. Thank you so much, Jules. So those of you who have been long in the ad tech policy space know that there's a lot of history here that goes as far back as 2015 era and the do not track signals. Now that we have state laws giving legal enforcement effect to this concept of global opt-outs, yes, the primary goal, Jules, like you said, is to get at the online sharing and tracking ecosystem. The fact that when individuals go to websites, the typical business model of most online content today is to share, sell, monetize that data in some way, often for advertising campaigns. So that is the case. And then, of course, once we had new laws in the United States hinging around opt-out rights, the immediate obvious criticism is that it's very difficult to go to every website that you've ever visited, to go to hundreds of websites and exercise opt-out rights on an individual basis. So this concept of universal opt-out mechanisms is designed to address that. And we already have seen many on the market that are doing this in line with the California AG's endorsement of the Global Privacy Control Specification, for example. So there's a lot here. We were very curious, and the reason we started looking into this was to see what this looks like from a user-facing perspective, whether all the tools kind of look the same, whether they're consistent, inconsistent. And we started with looking at the tools that are currently implementing the Global Privacy Control Specification. And we should say that that's a specific specification developed over the last few years and published, I think now maybe only like 2 years ago. This is a specification that is publicly available, can be adopted by any developer and integrated into any tool. And we've seen so far 2 browsers, Brave and DuckDuckGo's mobile browser, and 5 popular browser extension tools or plugin tools that are integrating this, like EFF's Privacy Badger and many others. So we looked at these, and let me turn it to you, Aaron, to talk a little bit about what we found.
Sure. I think to the extent that you can classify them, you can kind of think of them in 3 groups: the browser group, the privacy plugin group, and then the GPC plugin group. Browsers, if it's built into the browser, it's typically not even something that you would see from a user-facing standpoint. So maybe the best example of this is Brave. If you download the Brave browser, it will always send the signal, and your GPC signal should be respected by websites based on that. That's just technically how this works. It's typically how you would see this happen if things were integrated into the browser. It's not the sort of thing that you have to think about for other browser features. It's just a built-in feature of the browser. For the privacy plugins, they do GPC plus a whole bunch of other things to help manage privacy concerns you may have. A good example of something that is not within the ambit of the GPC, but is often a feature you will find on some of these other plugins like disconnect.me, is to prevent malvertising or malware advertising, which you may have seen some news articles about, where people are sending advertising out and actually getting it published on web pages that would actually take information from you and use it for nefarious purposes, rather than the typical commercial marketing stuff. Even traditional advertisers would like to see that sort of thing disappear, but it's hard to fight. And so these plugins have developed techniques to try and prevent that. In addition to that, they're adding things like the GPC so that users can have control over their privacy. And then the third category are plugins that are essentially built around just sending the GPC signal and making it as easy as possible for users to express control on when they're sending the GPC versus when they are not sending the GPC.
Aaron, just to start with browsers, the most popular leading browsers are not yet implementing the specific global privacy control specification, right?
That's correct. Yes.
So Chrome,
probably the browser with the largest market share that technically has an implementation of the GPC is Firefox, but configuring it as a user is extremely difficult. It is obviously not a feature that they are pushing as something that the typical user would be able to just go into a preference file and change.
Mm-hmm.
So one thing that's interesting to note is that many of the tools that are sending the GPC are also tools that are already maybe blocking ads or blocking cookies or blocking the kind of activity that the GPC is actually directing a site to not do. Now, obviously, companies might be selling your actual personal data records, and the GPC is broader than just sort of the cookie and tracking activity. But for many companies where they've long said we don't sell your personal information. Now, obviously, some do, but for many who don't, the relevance of the GPC has been primarily the fact that they have ad tech relationships of some sort, whether you're a publisher that carries ads, or even if you go to an advertiser's site, many of them might be retargeting you and might have ad tech code. Some of them might actually even be sharing, the data because they don't mind, or whatever the case is. And so for a lot of those folks, it might just be a zero out sort of thing. They're already they're not getting the cookie or the tracking stuff, and now they're getting a signal that says don't sell. So my estimation has been that the actual impact so far has been fairly limited to the extent that people have turned it on. It's been people who already have privacy tools that are preventing a lot of the third-party tracking. Is that a fair take? So before I hand back to you guys, I just want to make it clear to our audience, although we're going to kind of quibble with some of the issues around implementation, I certainly clearly think that having an easy way for people who do not want to have their data sold or do not want to have behavioral targeting or so on and so forth is key, is essential. One challenge that the industry has had, those who argue that there is an important role to play for ed tech in supporting media and supporting publishers and so forth, and I certainly agree with that. But there's long been an understanding that people should be able to opt out of that, whether it was via cookie-related opt-outs or browser controls or the like. And the fact that that's never been as reliable or stable or easy to use has sort of always undermined and created, I think, a lot of the agita. If the answer has always been, hey, if you don't like that, there's an easy to use button that really does what it's supposed to do, and then these things you don't want to happen will happen, it, I think, would have made it a lot easier to say, hey, we need ads. The ads have to have some data and reporting. We make more money on it. We have the ability to measure and explain what's going on. We can choose the audiences better. And if you don't like it, tick, 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 it's really super easy to say no, right? So the value, if this succeeds in a way I think we'd like it to succeed, would be, yeah, there are ways that data could be used. It's important for competition. If only the big companies have data, the new companies, the brands, there's logic to data being used to help shape and inform advertising, but it needs to be darn easy for audiences that are at risk or who just don't like it to say no. And we encourage folks to not quibble overly. The laws all were written in ways that say this needs to be default off unless it's clearly a browser plugin. So, it's practical. That being said, so A, follow it, respect it across the US. It's too complicated. It creates confusion to be dealing with this state by state. We need national standards, national privacy law. Lean into it, give people the out. That being said, there are some real complications and challenges in the way the technology and the law has developed. So let me pull in a question. Actually, we can start even jumping in and get to some of the other things we wanted to say by engaging. So, quick question: do you have to opt out in your device settings, for example, on Android before opting out in a browser? So here's an example, I think, of why we're in a pretty confused situation, right? So the tools we saw today, Aaron, were all web browser based only. This has nothing to do with all of what you do in apps right now. We don't see any GPC. Now, whether Apple and their tools kind of achieve the effect is a different story. But right now, it's browsers. I think you mentioned there was one mobile browser, but one of the limitations I think that exists today is that the GPC, as it has been drafted, is primarily, I think there's work being done, but is primarily a web browser, desktop or mobile web browser plugin type activity. Is that right?
That is absolutely correct. And it's a really interesting point to make because you could, in theory, the GPC specification is an HTTP header specification. You could, in theory, have this functional without having any web browser activity at all. So an example of that might be something like a smart thermostat. If you were collecting data based on thermostat adjustments to see if somebody would like to buy sweaters or blankets or what have you, right? And you were advertising based on how often somebody was at home adjusting their thermostat, and somebody at home did not want this, they can either, at this point, disable the thermostat entirely so they're not sending any signals, or in theory, you could buy a thermostat from a provider that supports the GPC signal. Now, that is all totally theoretical because right now, none of the implementations exist outside of a web browser context. Both on desktop and mobile, there are options for mobile, but the spec doesn't necessarily indicate you have to use this with a web browser. You could use this with a variety of other devices. Think about like IoT style devices, dedicated e-readers, game consoles, things that are web connected but don't necessarily get used for traditional web browsing.
Yeah, so let's separate the spec and the law, right? I think the law is, in theory, designed, and certainly you see the evolution in Colorado where it's actually even called a universal opt-out mechanism, right? So the notion that there should be a place where you can go that would really give you one effective way to say, whatever the things that are happening like downstream, like selling my data, here I am saying I don't want that. And we don't see that existing, but that is really the goal. What we do have is one implementation, that's an important one, a specification that was created so that everybody who receives browser information receives a particular set of yes, no type, signals, and knows that this means that a particular state law definition of sale should be applied to what happens there, right? So my vision, frankly, is that we do have universal controls, but given the fact that we have thermostats and we have cars and we have browsers and we have mobile and we have smart rings, we have a bunch of stuff, right? That is a place where that sort of company can get a message saying, whatever the stuff you're doing that is a sale in these jurisdictions, stop doing it. And the reason this is important is that there are lots of companies that are active across these different, media, right? You deal with Apple and Google and lots of apps on your desktop, on your browser, at home, and so on and so forth. And sometimes you're signed in, and it should be easy to know that this is you. And but sometimes you're not signed in, and sometimes you're signed in a different manner. And so, again, I think companies today, you see the signal, opt it out. But if we want this to really be what it can be, we need to get away from being wedded to this one particular sort of signal that kind of doesn't really tell us what state you're from, doesn't tell us. And again, right now, most of the states are somewhat similar, but they're not exactly, and they're going to start diverging. And so, the compliance people who we deal with, their heads are already melting down about what do I do with it prospectively? What do I do with going forward? And so on and so forth. Let's jump to the second question. If I'm an ad tech provider and I get a signal, what exactly am I required to do? Delete the data, send it downstream with the signal. How do I do it prospectively? Stacey, you want to grab that one? Oh, that's from our friend Omer. Look at that. I think he knows the answer to this, don't you?
Omer,
he's subtly telling us, actually, there's some complication here, and let's tease out those complications.
Omer, I see what you're doing here. The answer is there's still some inconsistency between the 3 states that have mandated some form of global opt-out signal, Connecticut, Colorado, and California, with respect to exactly what businesses are required to do. For example, California has the sort of classic core, do not share or sell information. And so unless there's some conflicting additional consent given, and there are rules around that in the regulations, a publisher or website should stop all downstream sharing. Not necessarily as far as deleting the data, although they could interpret it, I think, as a deletion request. They could interpret it as a request to limit the use of sensitive personal information. I think not required in California, but something they could do. But at a minimum would need to stop the sale and sharing. And then there's some evolving inconsistency in what I'm thinking of as consent hierarchies. When you layer on top of that the fact that a consumer could negate their own signal through, through first inconsistencies in the different signals and tools they might be using. For instance, sending a signal in one browser and sending another signal in a different browser, right? There's that layer of inconsistency across devices and tools and plugins and browsers. But then also potential for inconsistency in the additional consent hierarchies that a business can choose to have. So can you negate this through a cookie banner? Maybe, but in some states, not if you're using dark patterns, right? Not if you're manipulating the user into negating the signal and giving their consent when they don't really mean it. What about first-party consent if you are sending a signal to a company with whom you have an established relationship, your cell service provider or a Netflix or Hulu, right? You have separately an authenticated, verified account with that entity, and you've given consent or not given consent to various things within that. If the business can identify you as the same person, can that consent override the signal? And these are all, I think, evolving questions that are happening in the regulations in California and Colorado.
My pragmatic legal advice is, let's not complicate this at a time when nobody in massive numbers is using it. Right now, the regulators are looking at your site and they see ad tech. There's a lot of things ad tech does that are not a sale. There are things that are a sale. There's analytics. It's complicated. The law isn't perfectly parsing sale and retargeting, and then using this for analytics, but sometimes that might also be used for ad tech and sometimes not. It's a bit of a mess. Right now, the people that are using this are saying, I'm privacy sensitive. Turn the stuff off. Turn the stuff off. If we get to a point where 30%, 50%, where everyone is using this stuff, and you're like, well, I still need to at least do X and Y, then let's get into the details and try to parse the nuance. But right now, you just create risk. You piss off users. You quibble. You're going to have to explain how you somehow got all your downstream people to complicate contract this. And I get that people don't want to give that up, right? Because indeed, if 50% of people turn this off, then it's going to cut a big hole out of stuff. If some browser turns it on by default, which would be against the law, but who knows who's going to enforce that? I do think we saw, some fuzziness as to exactly what people know and what they're being told. And again, why sweat it right now? Go turn it off, be broad, and respect it in a maximal way, respect it, nationally. For those who want to start parsing the nuances, we need to do that because this is going to be an increasingly important, tool. But I think we can punt on some of the hard questions. Another question. Device de-identified data be regulated distinctly from traditional PII. So, oh gosh. Okay, look, we have argued long that personal information to super anonymous information is a spectrum. It's a risk-based decision. Nothing is ever perfectly absolute, and even explicitly personal information, sometimes John Smith can be a lot of John Smiths. The reality is that there is different degrees of pseudonymous data or whatever you want to call it. And it would be most nuanced for legislation and the consumer options to recognize that there is sometimes data that is less personal or more personal. And whether I delete data, meaning your account, might depend on whether I really know who you are, because you might actually want your bank account or your other account. Whether I flip off some advertising thing where you may not care one way or another, the decision might be, differently. Unfortunately, that's not been the path that the current legal models have gone in. I think that is a mistake, because at the end of the day, we end up backing out to do that. So, well, if I can't really know with certainty whether it's you, then I can or I can. So companies are left in this little bit of a gray zone, where the reality is there are places where I might be able to make a decision about you. And yes, that is legally perhaps personal, but it's less sensitive. Marketers use messy data. That's the challenge, right? We want to give you an opt-out, But the reality is marketers don't always know who you are. They're spraying and praying sometimes. And that's fine, as long as somehow they're more accurate than not. It might be worth spending money to sort of hope that they're reaching the right audience. But when you then say, hey, if you're in the same household or such, that you get those rights, and it might be actually something important or sensitive for me to give you access to data or so forth. So the laws went really wide on definition and then actually struggled to actually ensure that they weren't giving too much access to people who weren't actually the ones authenticated. We would argue that the best model is to recognize a role, as research laws have often recognized. HIPAA and FERPA always had certain limited data sets that were personal, but because they were pseudonymized, there's a long history of pharma using pseudonymized data. It's not the direction that it went. These things were declared, personal, and as a result, I think we need to live. We need to live with that. Okay, next question. What's our viewpoint on the current percentages of the 3 buckets of people? GPC, unaware, happy to not set, 20, 60, 20. Where is it likely to land in 2 years as bucket 2 becomes aware? All right, I'll let you guys comment on that. I will say that we saw a bit of a spike in GPC use like a month or 2 ago. Nobody seemed to understand what exactly the basis for that spike was. There was some scuttlebutt. I don't know what the percent today is of the number of browsers sending it, but I don't know. Any reaction, you guys, to that data?
I would guess that the numbers are still somewhat low. I have not seen any studies about this, though. So for those out there who are interested in researching this question, I think a lot of people would be very interested. The only reason I would guess that they're still low is simply because the GPC specification has not yet been adopted in any sort of really major popular widestream browsers. So, Aaron, I don't know if you know more about the market share of some of the tools.
It's really hard to say. You're right that we haven't had any big longitudinal studies looking at populations over time to see if they're just experimenting with this or actually using it on a regular basis and toggling it on or off based on their activity streams. I'm actually thinking maybe a slightly more interesting question isn't the percentage of users, but the percentage of major websites that are responding to GPC signals. And there have been studies investigating that. None of them have been super comprehensive, just a couple hundred websites at a time. And it seems like that has to happen first. There's a little bit of a chicken and the egg in the sense that users aren't going to use this unless they think servers and websites are actually respecting it. And that's kind of been solved by the California AG in the Sephora decision, basically saying this is an opt-out signal that you really should be paying attention to. So now servers will have to respond. If enforcement actions in response to the CPRA deadline end up focusing on the GPC, I would expect more and more servers to start using this. And then you will probably see, in that 2-year timeframe he outlined, a lot more users actually making affirmative decisions. Do I want to do this or do I not want to do this? But right now, probably the vast majority of people are simply unaware of the signal.
If your site, quote unquote, has ad tech embedded and you're not responding today, right? Assuming you sell data, as is many likely to be the case with ad tech, not only are you stupid, you're a stupid sitting duck, because it's visible and obvious, right? The regulators are scanning this stuff. You don't need to be a rocket scientist to download a little tool that shows you the third-party ad tech right there. Most of these companies proudly explain like what they do. They sell your data, they target the ad tech is displayed. And if I see that and you can't confirm that you are respecting it, you're at legal risk today. And as Aaron pointed out, we've seen the settlements. I do think long term, there's an interesting question as to whether some of this is going to be mooted, because, right now, Chrome is the only major browser that allows the third-party cookies that are typically the tool of this tracking to happen. Safari and Firefox are already blocking. Are there people who work around it? Blah, blah, blah. Yes, maybe. Probably already illegally done so. The FTC has enforced against people who work around those cookie settings. And Chrome, of course, is committed, it tells us, assuming the competition regulators don't stop it, to phasing out third-party cookies and whether competition regulators in Europe prevent that. My weekend reading is the latest report from the UK ICO and the joint work with the competition authority on their update on their privacy sandbox. So, open question as to whether the regulators, at least internationally, we haven't seen the US in its competition case against Google raise this particular point, but Apple and Apple devices at the app level, we've talked about the fact that these GPC tools don't work. Well, Apple has sort of jumped past that by saying, forget GPC, which is, again, default sharing is okay unless the user changes it. Apple's already said, sorry, you must opt in. Google has announced that it's going to do something in a mobile sandbox. So clearly the world is moving away from the current status quo. Maybe there'll still be a market for this with third-party ad tech if the competition regulators allow it. But Apple is going in a different direction. Google, for its own activity, is going in a different direction. You see Facebook investing in a very significant way in, on device, partly because it's being forced to, and partly because the technology is getting more robust. So we're moving away from this current ecosystem. We'll maybe talk on a different show about these email-based alternative IDs and how they may evolve. And obviously the signal would be relevant there. But I think there is a major trend that people should be well aware of, which is more of this is moving to on-device, de-identified things, projects that are being driven by these, different methods. Now, that doesn't mean that consent's not going to be relevant. The latest interesting news, those of us who were part of the FPF call on some of the European decisions, were even on-device, where Apple was held, they're challenging this, obviously, but the CNIL held Apple responsible for not getting consent, even for Apple's on-device use of data for its first-party advertising purposes. They've changed that since, but the CNIL hit them for that. Voodoo, I think a French developer, using not even Apple's mobile ad identifier, but using their vendor ID, which is only usable in a much more limited per company context, but many have been using that for advertising. They were held responsible for using that without express permission. So the whole kind of default sell, unless you use this technical mechanism, may be outstripped by the technology and the platform changes in Europe. The e-privacy mandate that you got to get consent before setting and reading obviously has already been a game changer. So future technology is going to play a big role, using big data at large scale to make smarter decisions in a way that's more limited than sort of spewing data through a wide third-party data ecosystem. But ad tech seems to have persevered for many generations despite challenges. Competition authorities may see, big companies holding the data only for, their advertising purposes or their utility in terms of data to be anti-competitive. Will these third-party identifiers that the Trade Desk and LiveRamp and others in the IAB are working persevere with privacy controls? Stay tuned to a future show. Stay tuned to the report that Stacey and Aaron and some of the team are putting together. And thanks to all of you who have joined us for this little taste of some of the interesting issues and developments. Peek at the fpf.org blog for other activity. Final words, Stacey, Aaron, anything you want to share with the audience before we zip off for the weekend?
Just that this is definitely an exciting time, and we expect to see big changes. These tools are obviously in development, and the user interfaces has not solidified at all. So this is a moving space.
100%. Yeah. Thanks to those who showed up and are following.
Final thought, policymakers who are trying to move forward and provide something useful here to consumers should start with understanding what the current ecosystem looks like. California still has a do not track disclosure that you must say in your privacy policy unless you are part of an industry self-regulatory program around behavioral advertising. Why didn't they repeal that while they replaced it with something very different? What is that? There was no spec there. There is a spec. Some browsers send it, others don't. It still exists. My head's exploding. The industry has cookie-based opt-out programs that still exist. DAA, you can get an opt-out cookie that will opt you out of all of these things. But if you delete that cookie, then you're back in unless you have a special plugin that will reinsert that cookie, right? And then the browsers have tools also that control cookies. So if you are actually an informed user here, and many are not, so hey, just there's tools, you turn them on. But if you're actually an informed user, you need to actually wake up and say, I've got a browser setting, and then I've got a mobile setting. And then there's these industry opt-outs with triangles in the corner of ads that take me to opt-out mechanisms. There are plugins that might delete the cookies that I'm accepting when I use an opt-out cookie. There's a law in California that tells me that people should say something about do not track in their policy, which has nothing to do with this control, which is called a global privacy control, but only works for the web. Luckily, most people are not informed. They're simply pulling switches and they're hoping good things happen. But to policymakers who actually want to do something that doesn't cause chaos and have the legal and compliance people scratching their heads saying, I don't understand, and that is effective, start with understanding. We're happy to share how it currently works so that you can think through, how can I make it better? What are the levers that I can turn, or what are the swaths of confusion that I can cut through so as to actually put things in place that companies can provide, that users can rely on. We can move forward and solve the big problems in the world. Like, what is Open Chat GPT doing with all of our data? What is AI doing? Are any of these ads discriminatory? Let's finally agree that people deserve a switch that gives them more privacy, that actually does something logical, coherent, and stable. Thanks for being part of this conversation. All of you have a happy Friday.